Chapter 23. Badal. Faddy retreated to the bathroom and locked himself inside the stall for the rest of the afternoon. He pulled his legs up onto the toilet and sat as still as a statue, his mind a kaleidoscope of shock, pain and disappointment. After an hour or so his calves became numb and he lowered his feet to the ground. He looked at the grubby floor strewn with toilet paper and a few pennies and tried to think of something else, anything else. His mind drifted to Claudia and her brother. They too had hidden in the bathroom while hiding out at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But unlike Claudia, whose story had worked out perfectly in the end, his was a disaster. Claudia had had her fun at the museum, had had her mystery solved by meeting Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, and then had headed home with her brother, safe and sound. For Faddy, things hadn't quite worked out the way he'd hoped. Neither had they for Mariam. I failed her again. A few seconds before the end of the day bell rang, he snuck outside and wandered towards the elementary school's playground. He sat on a bench across from the jungle gym, watching a bunch of second graders hang upside down like tree sloths. A bright spot of pink caught his eye, a Hello Kitty lunchbox sitting on the sidewalk. Sorrow and anger mingled, forcing him to close his eyes. After fleeing the art studio, he'd wanted to take cover. He didn't want to run into Arne or anyone else he knew, especially in the cafeteria. Now he didn't want to go home. He would have to tell Noor he'd lost and wasted her money. Sadness and rage bubbled through his veins, coupled with the unwelcome sense of shame. He winced, thinking back on how he'd acted like a jerk. Can't believe I ran out of the art studio like a crybaby, and I was rude to Miss Bethuna. But most of all, he still couldn't believe he'd lost. All that praying and patience of job for nothing. "Hey, Faddy!" called out a familiar voice from across the playground. Faddy tensed, looking for a way to avoid whoever was looking for him. He shot up from his seat, ready to duck around the corner and run back into the school, but it was too late. They'd spotted him. He watched a group of boys approach and he blinked with annoyance. "Hey, Faddy!" shouted a nasally voice. It was John. What does he want? As the clump of boys came nearer, Faddy recognised Masood, Zaid, Ravi and Carlos from World History and Civilizations class. There were half a dozen other boys he didn't know. "It's time," said Masood, his voice tensed. "Huh?" said Faddy. "Ike and Felix are meeting Ravi at Lake Elizabeth in half an hour," said Masood. "Why?" asked Faddy. "I told them I'd pay up this time," said Ravi. His horn-rimmed glasses sat crooked on his flushed face. "Yeah," said Zaid. He clenched his right fist and punched his left hand. "And we're all going to be waiting for them." A cooling salve of revenge rose up from within Faddy. It was time for Badal. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he said with growing excitement. "I called you last night, man," said Ravi, "but the line was busy." "Oh," said Faddy. Noor had been on the phone pretty much all evening. "And you weren't at lunch," said Masood. "But no matter, we found you now. Let's go." Faddy grabbed his backpack. "Let's go then." Hiding 10 boys in the bushes was not easy, but somehow Faddy and the others hunkered down behind the leafy branches while Ravi stood near the designated meeting spot. It was a secluded location, tucked away in a hidden curve of a walking trail. The lake was a few feet away, home to fat, frolicking ducks. Ravi stood shivering, peering nervously at the bushes. At the crack of a twig, he jumped. "Hang in there, Ravi," whispered Faddy. He hadn't the heart to tell him that he hadn't won anything in the Take Your Best Shot contest. Then again, neither had he. Ravi pushed up his glasses and nodded. He stared up the path, resigned to the plan. In his hand he held a paper bag that was supposed to hold a month's worth of lunch money. In reality it was filled with marbles. "It's 3:58, whispered Masood. This was the 5th time he checked his watch. "They're late," grumbled Carlos. "As if they care about keeping Ravi waiting," said John. His meek demeanour had changed. He seemed unusually amped up. "Shh," said Faddy. He leaned forward to peer through a gap in the leaves. Silence filtered over the spot just as Ike and Felix rounded the corner. "Yo, Ravi," shouted Felix. "You got my money?" Ravi gulped. Yeah, he squeaked. He held out the crumpled bag with a shaking arm. Faddy could hear the rattle of marbles. He tensed, going over in his mind their plan of action. As soon as Ike and Felix stood under the tree with Ravi, they were going to pounce. "Well, what are you waiting for? Hand it over," said Ike. "I've got video games to go buy." Ravi didn't budge. He was under strict orders to stay under the tree. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. "I don't got all day," said Felix. He came to a halt next to Ravi and held out his hand. Ike stopped next to him and folded his arms over his chest. Ravi thrust the bag into Felix's hand. "Now!" spat Faddy. Boys jumped out from all directions and surrounded the tree. They stood in a tight circle, faces set with stony expressions. "What the?" growled Ike. He and Felix backed up against the rough trunk. Ravi smiled in relief and dove between Carlos and John. "We've had enough of you bossing us around," he shouted, peering over the other boys' shoulders. "No more stealing our money, beating us up or calling us names," said Masood, stepping forward. "What are you going to do about it?" said Felix, straightening himself up to his full height, which was a good 6 inches above Faddy. "We're going to teach you a lesson," said Zaid. Faddy stepped forward. "You broke my camera," he growled. The violence in his voice startled him, but it felt good. "My father gave me that camera, and you had no right to attack me or mess with my stuff." "And I'm not a turban head," interrupted Carlos. "If you're going to be a bigot, at least get it right. I'm a Mexican man and proud of it. But hey, you're just a bunch of stupid bullies, so who cares what you say?" "Yeah, man," shouted John. There was a hard glint in his eyes. "Who cares what you say? Ike's nothing but poor trash pretending to be better than anyone else." Another boy stepped forward, one Faddy didn't recognise. He looked like one of the new Samoan kids. "You may have rich parents with fancy education," he said, pointing to Felix, "but you're just a loser who can barely read." As the other boys laughed, Faddy joined in, feeling an elation intoxicating him. It felt good to be the powerful one, the one who called the shots. "Don't you dare call me that," said Felix. He clenched his fists and stepped forward. "Loser," shouted the Samoan boy. "Loser, loser, loser," chanted the boys. Felix's face turned bright red and he inched back towards Ike. Fear lined both boys' faces, and Faddy was thrilled. They're getting a dose of their own medicine. "Come on, let's pound them," said Zaid. He sounded eager, but he looked a bit hesitant. Faddy felt it too. It was one thing to threaten and scare the boys, but it was another to actually beat them up. Yeah, said Masood, bouncing from one foot to the other. "Let's do it." The boys started to crowd in toward the tree. "Come on, you two," piped in Ravi. "Try punching me." He danced in front of the boys, daring them to hit him. As Ravi ducked away, John stepped forward. Faddy frowned. John was struggling with something behind his back. "John, no!" Faddy gasped, horrified. It was a huge fallen branch. Masood grabbed John's arm as the skinny boy waved the sharp, heavy branch in front of Felix's frightened face. "Hey, I'm just scaring him," grumbled John. "No, John," said Masood. He wrested the branch away from the younger boy. Faddy's euphoria fizzled like a coal drenched in cold water. He looked from the gang of boys back to the tree where Ike and Felix sat huddled in fear. All thoughts of revenge disintegrated. Beating them up won't solve anything. It won't bring my camera back. "This is getting out of hand," he said. All eyes turned towards him. Most of the boys nodded while John and Zaid shook their heads. "We can't beat them up. That would make us as bad as they are." "But they've been mean to us for years," complained Zaid. "Yeah, this is payback," grumbled John. "No," Masood sighed. "Beating them up won't solve anything." Faddy looked at the boys in turn and they nodded their agreement. The Samoan boy frowned. "All right," he said at last. Faddy turned towards Ike and Felix. "Remember this. If you try to bully anyone at school again, we're going to take care of business. I suggest you really think about what you're doing." Felix and Ike nodded with jerky movements, looking for a way out. Boys, called Faddy, why don't we call these two off so that they remember our little chat? Masood grinned. He, along with the rest of the guys, grabbed hold of Ike and Felix and threw them into the lake.